Hi, and welcome to Teaching Tip Tuesday, brought to you by the Center for Inclusive Teaching and Learning at UWSP. Last week, I talked to you about the ways that students fool themselves when it comes to their learning activities and pointed you toward things that you can do as instructors to help prevent your students from self-deception about their learning. But let's be serious for a minute. The students aren't the only ones who deceive themselves about teaching and learning. Instructors do it too. And the reasons we fool ourselves are a little bit more complex than they are for students. When you're employed as an instructor at a teaching university, the expectation is that you should be a good teacher. There's a lot of pressure on instructors to ensure that students are retained, which means there's pressure to ensure that most students pass their courses. And nobody wants the uncomfortable attention that would be turned on them if their course were to have higher than desired DFW rates. Nobody wants to admit that their students may not be learning what instructors want them to, or that grades may be inflated to ensure retention. There are also folks who are afraid that tenure or promotion could be withheld for these sorts of things, or that the university will make departmental funding decisions based on student performance and retention. There are a lot of reasons that it's just easier to fool ourselves about student learning. But this isn't like woebegone, and not everybody can be above average. Having an accurate picture of student learning is essential to improving teaching and learning at UWSP. So this week, I'd like to cover some of the ways that psychology professor Stephen Chu from Samford University and others have suggested that instructors fool themselves into believing that their teaching is more effective than it probably is. I'll also point you towards some best practices that should help you to avoid these kinds of pitfalls. One of the biggest ways we fool ourselves into believing that our students are learning is that students are getting good grades. They get good grades on tests, they get good grades on papers, they get good grades in class. We tell ourselves that good grades means students learned what we wanted them to, and therefore we must be doing a good job of teaching them. So, how is this self-deception? I could go on forever about this one, but I'll try to hit the highlights. This combines a few different facets. In many cases, our grading facilitates shallow learning. We often have poorly aligned assessments, and we use variable standards for grading. I'm going to discuss these in the context of multiple choice quizzes and tests, essay-based assessments, and courses overall. Let's begin with multiple choice quizzes and tests. A lot of the exams that students take are in multiple choice format. While these are not inherently bad, it's easy for instructors to write them in such a way that doesn't require understanding in order to choose the correct answer. Usually, if students can recognize the key words that are associated with the topic in question, they can identify the only possible answer because the distractors don't use those key words. Most of these exams don't require students to distinguish between similar answers as a way to discriminate between recognition and nuanced understanding. Shallow learning can give students a good grade on the exam, even though students have not achieved the learning we claim to want from them. It has become common practice to make many low-stake quizzes rather than large, stressful exams, which in many ways is good. However, these frequent quizzes are usually not cumulative, so students don't really need to have deep or long-lasting knowledge to score well. And although their combined scores can be high, the students are not learning deeply enough to be able to recall information in the future. Another common practice is to exclude from exam grades the points from questions that large numbers of students perform poorly on. These might be evidence of ineffective learning, but as soon as we throw those points out, the grades go up. Students are getting good grades, so students learn, right? But the grades are misleading since there was something we wanted students to learn, but we excluded their failure to learn it from the grade. Finally, when instructors construct their exams, many ask themselves what questions they can ask, not what questions they should ask. This often means that rather than focusing on questions that evaluate student achievement of specific learning goals, questions often deal with trivia that lends itself to easy memorization, but is irrelevant to assessing student achievement of the learning goals that we outlined for them. Alignment of learning outcomes and assessments is key for appropriate measurement of student learning. Now let's consider essays. For essay exams and papers, it's common practice to read through many students' answers before deciding how to apply points. So rather than having a set standard based on desired learning outcomes that students are expected to reach, instructors alter their expectations based on student performance. So students are often rewarded with good scores for doing less than we'd actually like them to. Grading criteria for a lot of written work includes points for things not taught in the class for which the students are writing. Things like grammar, paper structure, and spelling. In a lot of cases, these are things that grammar and spelling checkers should detect, or that just have nothing to do with the course in question. This can significantly bias grades. For example, and I'm making this up because I don't want anybody to think I'm talking specifically about them. Imagine a 100-point paper submitted in a business class in which 10 points are allocated to grammar and spelling and 25 points are allocated to paper organization, neither of which are taught in the business course. This means that only 65 points of the assignment reflect stuff that was taught in the business class. Assuming that a student gets a score of 80 overall, which would be interpreted as a student having done pretty well, and got perfect points for organization and grammar, this means that they got 45 out of 65 remaining points, or 69%, on the actual course content that aligns with specific learning outcomes of the class, which doesn't really reflect having learned that much. Alternatively, a student may have scored all of these 65 points for business content, showing mastery of the learning goals of the course, but may be a terrible writer and might have gotten very low marks for organization and grammar, and thereby scoring lower than the person who learned less in the course. Finally, let's look at grades in courses. Grades in courses often include aspects of student performance and behavior that are not reliably associated with learning, things like participation and attendance. Although participating and attending can help students learn, they are by themselves not indications that students have learned. So, in general, student grades are not a great indicator of learning or of the quality of teaching. Next, instructors often confuse content coverage with student learning. Just because you lectured on something doesn't mean that you've taught it, and it doesn't mean that students have learned it. Teaching means that an instructor's responsibility goes beyond just telling students what they need to know in lecture. Teaching to produce lasting, deep learning requires much more attention to learning than just coverage of content. Teaching means activation of prior knowledge, providing opportunities for recall, application, and elaboration, and engaging students in effective learning strategies. Instructors often confuse student engagement with student learning. Although student enjoyment and engagement during a class is important to learning, it doesn't signify that students are learning. This is one of the reasons that grading for participation is problematic. Students can be or appear to be engaged for all sorts of reasons, because the instructor is charming or funny, or because they're trying to impress a potential hookup who sits near them. Paying attention is a good first step, but without opportunities for recall practice and application of knowledge to new situations, there may be relatively little learning going on. Alternatively, what appears to be engagement by a student may not mean that they're learning or that they're actually engaged. They may be looking at you with rapt attention while daydreaming about what they're going to do this weekend. Finally, instructors often confuse student struggle with student learning. Learning is effortful, but not all effort and struggle produces learning. Students may be struggling because they're overwhelmed, because they're unable to make appropriate connections, because they don't know where to start, rather than struggling because they're making so many connections that they're learning a ton. Having a hard time doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning. So, as an instructor, what can you do to stop fooling yourself about student learning? How can you be sure that what you're seeing is student learning? First, you need to begin by making sure that your course is well aligned. Every task you expect students to perform should help students achieve the stated learning outcomes for the course. Discussing how various course components relate to student achievement of learning goals goes a long way toward getting students to value the work that they're doing in class. If you have any questions or would like help considering the alignment of your course, schedule a consultation with CITL designers. Next, re-evaluate your assessment and grading practices to ensure that grades reflect the achievement of learning outcomes. You can begin by tilting all of your assignments. A lot of student struggle is related to not understanding what the instructor wants. You can reduce both student struggle and cognitive overload by making tasks and criteria for success clear to students. Make sure that your test questions are aligned with learning outcomes. Don't include irrelevant factoids or questions that have no bearing on measuring student achievement of learning goals. If using multiple choice question formats, include distractors that force critical discrimination based on deep understanding rather than mere word recognition. Keep your grading associated with the achievement of standards rather than waiting to see how students perform before deciding how to grade. Assignments should be graded with rubrics that have criteria aligned with learning outcomes, making the standards clear to students in advance. Don't give points for things that you're not teaching. Grammar, spelling. If anything, subtract points for not meeting expectations that they should have mastered in previous courses. Don't give points for activities that don't reliably indicate learning, things like participation and engagement. Next, plan your assessment so that shallow learning, short-term memorization, and mere recognition are not enough to give students a good grade. Consider ungrading for formative activities to put the emphasis on learning. Consider comprehensive quizzes or exams with 80% new information and 20% older information. That's a good split. Structure papers and projects that reward deeper learning and application of cumulative knowledge. Finally, engage in best teaching practices for deeper learning. Activate students' prior knowledge before teaching them something new. Even when students have deeper learning, they may not immediately remember everything they know. Provide students with opportunities to recall prior information before building upon prior knowledge. Refresher quizzes, brainstorming sessions, and building group concept maps are great strategies to help students access prior knowledge. Providing review materials for those who can't recall as much can also be helpful. Encourage students to make connections between multiple topics. When recalling prior knowledge, often one thought leads to another. Having a good mental map in which students have multiple pathways to different topics through interconnections between them is a great way to prepare students to recall information in the future. Provide opportunities for metacognitive reflection. In order to study effectively, students need to understand what they know and how they're learning it. Embed frequent recall practice into your course. Practice may not make perfect, but it always makes better. The more often we have to recall knowledge, the better we get at recalling it. The more we have to apply knowledge, the better we get at it. It's easy for instructors to fool themselves into thinking that students are learning more than they are. Adhering to data-driven practices can help us better understand and improve student learning. And that's this week's teaching tip, brought to you by the Center for Inclusive Teaching and Learning here at UWSP. Remember, at CITL, we offer support for course design, learning activities, assessment, and pedagogy. Visit our website to schedule a consultation today.